Hey everyone, it's Carpo. As many of you know, ethnobotany is one of my, one of my paths, many paths. And a friend of mine gave me these books a couple of years ago. We have Pharmacopoeia, which is Power Plants, Poisons, and Herbcraft. And we have Pharmacognosis, Plant Teachers, and the Poison Path. And a good friend of mine gave me these about 4 years ago, and I've just started really getting into them. I was waiting for the right time. It's very interesting. It's done in a kind of a riddle format, but it's got all the different, drugs, their effects put into a lot of symbolism in it. There's a lot of speak about various things, mushrooms, stuff like that, psychedelics, but it's fantastic stuff. It's done in a poetic format, and it shows you a lot of these poisons that can be utilized, that have been utilized by the ancients and by Native Americans for, centuries, and goes on to explain how if you want to know how plants work, your best bet is to find a shaman or someone who's involved in these plants, someone who has experience through their culture. And it's not recommended for everyone, but some of these are like very poisonous, like certain wild cherry trees, which have a high degree of cyanide, but you can smoke a couple leaves and for the right effects, a sedative effect. Same way that the natives smoked tobacco. A lot of people say the Native Americans respected tobacco, but the truth is that most of the elders were addicted. They smoked larger and larger amounts to get more and more of the effect. And so we're not the only culture that's affected by poisons. Everything gets abused. Now, cannabis is one of my allies. I smoke marijuana, and it is my ally, but I don't abuse it anymore. I used to smoke all day. Now I smoke in the evening at my special times. Tobacco, I don't smoke very much, but I still smoke it. And it's always been kind of an ally of mine. But the whole nature of poison, the idea behind these power plants is, it's really good stuff. I was going to read this chapter about mercury and sulfur, but I don't want to get into archetypes or symbolism, and I especially don't want to get into alchemy. But the idea of sulfur, the brimstone, fire and brimstone, that's from the symbolic of the unwavering state of man's ignorance. And the mercury is to bring forth the knowledge, to bring forth true virtue and be a person. And a lot of this is just written in such poetic form that it's really not easy to read, but I'll read a couple parts. Plant people, to follow the way of poisons, it is essential to learn about plants. As you learn about plants, you will, by the by, meet plant people. Be clear now, most of the plant people you meet are not on the poison path, but all of the plant people are teachers nonetheless. They are doctors, though the doctoring of some of them is most subtle. Almost every gardener is a plant person, as are botanists and horticulturists. Some existentialists are not plant people. Despite the sprouting of fractal ferns and algorithmic roses, there are no plants in cyberspace. Not that one could eat, anyway, nor in the noosphere. Some realms are filled with plants. Adonis was born right out of the trunk of a myrrh tree. Buddha, according to tradition, had his enlightenment beneath a tree, and his mother, Maya, is portrayed holding the branch of the sacred sal tree as she gives birth. And Jesus, though he once cursed a fig tree to death because it was out of season, died on a tree. That counts for something in the world of plants. Remember that Socrates once bragged to Phaedrus that he had nothing to learn from the plants of the countryside, and how he was forced to swallow more than his words. For those who don't know, Socrates had to drink hemlock. He was required to pay a small fine, and he believed it was against his morals and principles, so he chose to drink the hemlock. Basically chose suicide over compromising his integrities. That's pretty intense. But I never knew that he said he couldn't learn anything from the plants. How ironic. There's a lot in here about shamans and shamanistic practices, the nature of plants. But this is the one. There's one called The Great Work, which is just a phenomenal little chapter. But I don't really know which one to read. I could read this Great Work. I'll just leave it with this one. This is kind of in a poetic form. So when I do this, it's in italics. It's like a separation. So because it's an interesting read. It's called The Great Work. The great work is accomplished through the great stone. Why settle for less? The great stone is the lapis philosophorum, the wonderful stone of the philosophers, and the grail of our quest. The stone is something you create, not something you find lying around. The great work consists of preparing the great stone and then applying it. It is the preparation of the stone that is crucial. Alchemically, after all, stones are many and easy to come by. The application of the stone is the last stage of the process and is called reddening by some alchemists and yellowing by others. As Paracelsus said, the philosopher must develop the stone from potentiality into activity. Temper is important here. After the individual application, there is the public marketplace application. It is important not to neglect this political aspect of the process, as the political aspect will certainly not neglect you. He with ears to hear, let him hear. In traditional Western alchemy, the elements are sulfur and quicksilver. Sulfur, quicksilver, and salt forming the alchemical triad. And the triad is Hegelian in the sense that the salt feeds back into sulfur. Sulfur is said to fix the breath, the spirit, the quicksilver part. Quicksilver, mercury, is pneuma, what the Taoists call yin, the solvent that dissolves away the fixed part, the sulfur, the part that is stuck. And the process is repetitive. It is like an alembic flask with the long neck bent around and joined to itself, so that the distillate returns to the boiling chamber. That is because sulfur has its fiery, insistent aspect that won't quite go away with any amount of mercury. Don't try to disprove this. So Jacob Boehme says, sulfur is in the outward world, viz., in the mystery of the great God's manifestation, the first mother of the creatures. Mercury is the wheel of motion in the sulfur. Jacob Boehme, Signatura Renan. As for our mercury, never forget that though it is most essential for our work, and much beloved, it contains a subtle poison. Both Boehme and Paracelsus agree on this point. Paracelsus adds that it is the work of the alchemist to separate the poisons from the arcanum. The poison attacks the fixed properties, themselves moribund poisons, and dissolves them. Poison is antidote, and antidote poison. When everything is fixed and dissoluble is dissolved, continuing cooking yields the salt. Salt is the ash, the basic part, the philosopher's sal. The sal is what was there all along, the part you can't see until you get rid of everything else. It is your birthright. Gaber called the raising of dry matter, so that it collects and adheres in the head of its own flask, sublimation. Paracelsus said that sublimation is the single and only operation of the work. After your cooking, get rid of the salt, perhaps with mercury. The salt is already tainted, has become something else, become something. There's not really any problem here. The salt takes on a yellow cast because the sulfur is self-engendering. And as I say, that's not bad. The process is what's important. The transmutations continue. If you let the alembic cool, metaphor becomes superstition. That line. I love that line. Psychologists sometimes miss this point. Poets ought never. So what is the mercury for? A plant person. There are so many levels. On one level, it is the plant itself. On another level, mercury is the active principle. Then again, clearly, it is liquefied consciousness. Or again, it is the act, or more subtly, the desire that leads to the act. Now we can see the poisonous part. In the corporeal realm, mercury is identified with blood and semen. Sulfur is in the water in which they burn. Sulfur is the womb whereinto we must enter if we would now be born. Jacob Boehme, Signatura Rerum. So sulfur is the matrix, the material. That should be plain. Plain if those alchemists didn't keep using the same word to mean different things in different sentences. It happened that, meditating on things as they are, my mind becoming sublime and my senses calmed, as one sated with pleasure or exhausted from fatigue, a being of vast and boundless form appeared before me and called my name and asked, "What is it you want to know? What is it you want to see?" Hermes Trismegistus, opening lines of Poimandres. Traditionally, the vegetable work has been considered inferior to the work on metals. There is perhaps some truth to this assertion, especially in regard to the work with elementals, such as relativism. Well, is relevant. But alchemists working with metals can wander off as endlessly into the involuted spirals as any vegetalista, as history attests. At least in the vegetable work, there is no connection to the earth as fertility and life, while the mineral work is subterranean, rooted beneath the deepest mines. I'm of course speaking vulgarly here. Nonetheless, for the purists, I have attempted to maintain alchemical correspondences. Become one with the work. The true alchemist is no different than the work itself. That speaks for itself. There's nothing else I can add to that. You might have to listen to it 3 or 4 times before you get it, and I'm probably going to have to read it 5 or 6 times before I really absorb it all. But I understand this. I understand the symbolism, the archetypes, and it's pretty interesting. I'll just go with one more here. For poisoners, for the vegetable work, it is most important to have strong sun medicine. Strong sun medicine will allow you to go further in the night, will act as an anchor and a beacon in the realms beyond Arcturus. Might save you even from ignoble rebirth. Sometimes it's easier to leave one's body than it is to find it again. Solar medicine is evident. You can spot it in a person's stance and posture. In style, the sun doctor is conventional or outlandish, but if outlandish, precisely so. Lunar medicine is more subtle. Moon doctors survive where others succumb. In jewels or in rags or naked covered with ashes, they will eat worms or a roadkill. If worms or a roadkill are what's served for dinner. Some say that for lunar masters, solar medicine is unimportant, but not so. You need both of them together. The solar Mercury is a tragedian. The lunar Mercury wears motley. The lunar Mercury dissolves immensities. It is yoga, not philosophy. Mind, body, thoughts, and desires blow away in a whirlwind orgy. All quicksilver confounds and destroys. It poisons the finest artifice, but also sustains. It is the rhythm of blood and the diaphragm, the universal solvent that slowly precipitates the lunar salt. Lunar salt is the mark of the work, recognized by what is absent rather than what is achieved. Good stuff. Good stuff. It goes on to talk about methodology. It's right here. Just going to finish with this last part, the methodology. Ethnobotany should be considered a proper subset for our work. Ethnobotanists are generally both botanists and anthropologists. It is essential for the alchemist to have a basic knowledge of these two disciplines if she is to avoid certain terrible pitfalls on the path, such as clownish foppery or early death. No mistake here about the seriousness of our endeavor and its concomitant dangers. I remember once seeing a group of edible agaricus in a meadow near an old oak tree, and right in the middle was a cluster of Amanita phalloides, the veil washed off by recent rain, and the characteristic greenish yellow. I remember thinking of how if one mushroom were carelessly dropped into a collection basket along the other mushrooms, the stew would contain enough poison to take away not only the collector but his family and guests at his table as well. The world's most dangerous sport, ethnobotany, and ethnology generally are important to our quest for several reasons. For one, traditionally, poisoners have never lived in a vacuum, which is really a tautology. They worked with cultural context that, if not actively supporting and encouraging their efforts, at least provided the special consensus, to borrow Carlos Castaneda's term, necessary for spiritual, social, and psychological integration, which can be the difference between being an eccentric and being a freak. Good books. Check them out. Definitely enjoy them if you're interested in the poisons path and the plant path. But there's a lot of really good little pictures, descriptions of plants. I mean, there's just cool little pictures, rattles, information about cultures that we don't really seem to follow as much anymore. And I think that a lot of these, there was a time a few years ago where I wanted to take up shamanism. And after talking with enough people about it and doing my homework, the most prominent shamans are aware that everyone is a shaman, that we're all our own shaman. See, in the ancient days, we could, hundreds of years ago, or still today in certain cultures, we could take someone and make them our group shaman, and let them do the searching, let them do the understanding between nature, and use them as a medium of exchange for information between us and the ethereal. And over time, that specialized task fell into all of our laps. Now the information's available. Perhaps these folks didn't have reading and writing, and they couldn't spend that much time teaching each other how the world really worked, so they hired someone to do it, just like we hire a politician. And nowadays, we all realize that, while shamans are slowly disappearing, we all have the option to become our own shaman. And I know there's a lot of folks that are opposed to using plants in a shamanistic sense, but very few shamans don't use plants. That's part of the experience. And a lot of folks have this image about drugs or anything that alters consciousness as being considered a drug and being considered bad. But the more you look into everything we eat, you realize that everything alters our consciousness. When you eat, your body produces chemicals that put you in a good mood, make you full. You alter by drinking certain amount of water, or even eating a pancake. But drugs are in a separate realm. Plant teachers, and these chemicals that are in these plants, though we don't understand them yet. I mean, even like, say, salvia, one that's been around, used for other shamans in Mexico and Oaxaca for, hundreds of years. We've just been able to recently isolate mitragynine, that's from kratom, salvinorum, which is the main ingredient in salvia. And it's kind of its own, and when we talk about alkaloids, alkaloids are the part of the plant that can cause the effects, So generally, if you can test for alkaloids, you can see a plant has potential to be a teacher. But my belief is that these plants are conscious entities, that they have been here, succeeding for much longer than we can imagine, and they have something to teach us. And it's like someone said, perhaps this medium, perhaps it's not the plants themselves that are teaching us, but perhaps the plants are a conduit for a different realm to come through us and experience. Anyone who's eaten mushrooms enough times can find that you'll have very similar experiences. People will read each other's minds. Strange things happen when you're high on psychedelics. So, is it the mushroom itself, or is it the mushroom is just a kind of a conduit? Or perhaps it turns on your antennas. Not sure how all this works, but I highly respect and revere all poisons, even some of the most intense ones. And everything has a place. And it's just a matter of being very careful and finding out where that place is. Because everything we do creates chemical changes in our body. Whatever we find happy. If we get stoned and it makes us happy, that's considered bad. But if we get say, come across a windfall or earn a bunch of money and we're happy, that's okay. It has to do with the idea that altering your consciousness is considered negative by some. But everything alters your consciousness. Every good thing that happens to you gives you a rush of energy. And perhaps the plants aren't actually giving you the high, but maybe just a conduit. So we don't know. But ethnobotany is one of my several paths, and I plan to pursue it endlessly, because we know that pharmaceutical companies are spending 90% of their money destroying rainforests to find cures, and then they take 90% of their drugs are actually derived from natural sources. So every plant, there's a perfect balance. Every plant can cure something, and humanity can cure the plants. So we work as a team. Team Green.